So let's start, Ritu. You're muted, Ritu.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this wonderful afternoon with a fantastic lady, Ms. Kalpana Sharma. We've all been looking forward to listening to her about this masterclass. Before I go any further, I would like to invite Dr. Sharda, who's our Director for Population First, to address and welcome formally everyone to this class. Over to you, Sharda.
Thank you, Ritu. And a very warm welcome to all of you for joining us on a Saturday afternoon. And in fact, Kalpana said, two journalists really prefer Saturday afternoon when I told her that it is in the afternoon. So it's really nice that so many of you have registered and are going to join this session. This is a masterclass by Kalpana Sharma on integrating gender perspective in media reporting. It's 2 years since the pandemic has struck, and just as we are getting very comfortable having these webinars, we are also very much fatigued by the webinars. We don't feel like attending any webinars anymore. I remember in the very early, time of period of the pandemic, I was so conscious of facing the camera and talking to people I don't see. So I would shift, I would turn, I would want to switch off my video as soon as possible, which is true to an extent even today. And we all have come a long way. We have learned to use the technology. And I'm working from remotely from Hyderabad. Ritu is working from Lucknow. So the world has really shrunk. And at the same time, there are many challenges which are being posed by the technology as well as by the crisis that we are all facing. It's nice in this context to see so many of you. We have one more webinar in another 2 weeks, and that will bring us to the end of this year. And I would say that this year was much easier for us because we got used to the new normal, doing things online, etc. So we will be having one more workshop on gender patriarchy and sensitizing to those concepts for journalists from UP and Madhya Pradesh and the Northern Belt. So this particular masterclass is based on the work done by our fellows. So on gender reporting on COVID from a gender perspective. Last year, we have increased the number of fellowships from 4 to 617. And this year we have given 15 fellowships because we felt that in the current situation of pandemic where journalists are not having enough income, plus most of them are out of jobs, and also the papers have gone digital and nobody is really interested in writing serious stuff about the pandemic, particularly from a gender perspective. So we thought that it is important to increase the number of the fellowships and give an opportunity for the media persons to pursue what really makes them feel passionate about something that they feel passionate about. They should be able to write about and not stop doing so because they don't have resources or they don't have the assurance of space in the publication. So we take the permission or the undertaking from the editors that they will publish the articles published under the fellowship. So that gives them the confidence of having space to publish as well as the resources to go and pursue investigative stories. So I thank all the fellows who have done amazing work to go and write stories about gender and COVID. And I'm really looking forward to Kalpana's inputs on the same because yes, we have written good stories, but it is good to have an expert say how we have done, where we could have done better, or what else we could have added to the stories, and to make the stories more rounded, more inclusive, and bring in greater depth into the analysis. So I thank Kalpana for going through all the English and translated entries to prepare for this session. And I'm sure all the winners and the fellows who are attending this session today will benefit from this masterclass. Please feel free to ask your questions. It's going to be a very informal kind of a thing. I know that Kalpana doesn't like very structured kind of interaction and presentations, etc., etc. So you have a great resource here with you today. So don't hesitate and put your questions in the chat box, or raise your hand and ask the question whenever you feel like interacting with her. Over to Ritu to introduce Kalpana.
Thank you, Dr. Sharda. And once again, a very warm welcome to Ms. Kalpana Sharma, who, as we all know, is an independent journalist. She's also an author and a columnist, former deputy editor of The Hindu. In her 4 decades as a full-time journalist, she's also held senior positions in Himmat Weekly, Indian Express, Times of India, and Economic and Political Weekly. She's the author of Rediscovering Dharavi, Stories from Asia's Largest Slum, which was published by Penguin India, and has edited Missing, half the story, Journalism as if Gender Matters, which was commissioned by Population First and was published by Zuban Books. Her areas of interest include environmental, developmental, and gender issues. We really look forward to this power-packed masterclass with her. Welcome once again, ma'am.
Thank you, Sharda, and thank you, Ritu. First of all, let me say that I'm a journalist, so this masterclass business frightens me, and I think some of the journalists on this group might feel the same. So I would have much rather called it a conversation about how to integrate gender into reporting, because there's no formula. I've tried to do it, and I'll share with you why I came up with that conviction that gender ought to be integrated into reporting. But I would really hope that we can have a conversation, because I'd like to know from those of you who've had the fellowship, and even those of you who've not, but who've thought on the subject, what you feel are the problems and the hurdles in trying to do stories with that perspective, keeping in mind always that the whole media structure has changed in India very drastically now. So on the one hand, the spaces that we had maybe in the 80s have gone, but on the other hand, many more spaces have opened up, right, with the whole digital world. So it's a bit of both that presents itself to journalists, but also it means that I think the obvious doesn't work anymore. When we had those spaces in newspapers, when newspapers encouraged journalists to write on, say, I write on developmental and environmental issues, you got published, because there was a space for it, and the newspaper felt it was an important issue. Now these issues are also downgraded, except if there's a disaster. And then to get a story in a way, it's a bigger challenge, because you have to be far more innovative. You have to come up with new angles. It's not the obvious that you report. Writing on gender doesn't mean you just take a report that has come out giving statistics and just make that into a story. That's not what we're discussing here. So the way I'll do it is, let me just talk. Some of you are familiar with this, but let me repeat again how, as a journalist now, actually next year it will be 5 decades, I'll complete 50 years as a journalist, how I came to this realization that we have to integrate gender into our reporting, that it shouldn't be a separate thing. When I started in journalism, all newspapers had these women's pages, and the women's pages were full of cookery columns and how to decorate your house and how to dress as a bride and blah blah blah. And once in a while there'd be a serious article. So that's how women's issues were perceived. But the 80s also saw the rise of the women's movement, and which at that time, even though it took up issues to do with women, in the sense It fought for changes in the rape law, in the dowry law, etc. It located these very clearly in the politics of that time, you know. So even those of us who were journalists who got attracted and felt ourselves to identify with the women's movement, we saw it as part of a larger fight for a just society. And as I always understood it, you cannot have a just society if half your population is suffering from injustice, namely women at that time. And now, of course, our understanding of gender has also widened to include trans and people who don't identify with the binary of male-female. But for me personally, actually, the sort of eureka moment, so to speak, was when I was working with the Center for Science and Environment in Delhi with Anil Agarwal on the first Citizens Report on the State of the Environment, which came out in 1982. And this was at a time when I had a sort of hiatus between Himmat Weekly, which I worked with through the emergency and thereafter, and Indian Express, which I joined later. It was for me, in fact, working with Anil was like a masterclass in the environment, because we discussed, what are the issues this Citizens Report should cover. And the way we decided on the subjects was based on feedback from groups that were working amongst communities who said these are the issues that matter to them. So whether it's forests or land, the perspective was dictated by that. But when we came to the energy chapter, I remember we discussed, hydel energy and thermal energy and nuclear energy, and how as the country progressed, there was the need for electricity. And Anil said, no, the most important energy is cooking energy. He said, we, because we live in cities, we don't even think about it, but the majority of women, their workload is so much greater because the only energy that they can use to cook, and they have to cook, is fuel wood, which they spend a lot of time going out and collecting. It adds to their burden of work, where they have to collect that fuel wood. They also have to collect water, and they have to sit in these houses with these chullas, and they inhale all that poisonous smoke, which also affects their health. So in fact, cooking energy should be the main focus of the energy chapter. And, for me, I realized that, here we are just talking about energy. And yet, if you really look at it from the dimension of gender, it's very clear what the priority ought to be, And I think that made me understand that, whether I write on developmental or environmental issues, this is what my focus ought to be. I should at least attempt that kind of focus. It's not always easy, but it is possible. So whether it was writing about thermal power pollution, for instance, or displacement. Recently, I read a story again about Singrauli. I went to Singrauli in 1984 when the first power plant of NTPC had been set up there. And already you could see from the displacements that had already taken place because of the coal mines that women had to struggle to rebuild their lives in these resettlement colonies, which were not at all like the places where they had lived, which were either submerged by the lake or the power plant had taken them over. So, displacement also, I realized, had this gender angle. And I personally got the opportunity to take this further when Mr. Verghese, who was then, B.G. Verghese was the editor of the Indian Express. He invited me to start writing a column in Express magazine called The Other Half. I mean, I called it The Other Half. But he said, write from a gender perspective. He didn't say write on women. He said, write from a gender perspective. And it was a challenge, but I found that each time I had to write, actually, there was always an issue. So by that time, I had relocated to Bombay. And one of the first things that took place were these terrible demolitions of the slums in pavement dwellers in Bombay that took place at the height of the monsoon during the Antleg regime. And, these poor people, as it is, they live in these extremely, like literally a tarpaulin and held up to two poles against a wall. And these BMC, the municipal corporation people, just came and demolished all those huts and packed them all into buses and said, go home. These are people who had lived on that pavement for like 20 years, 30 years. Some of the women who I spoke to had come from Madhubani in Bihar, at least 20 years before this demolition took place. So I set out to actually talk to the women and try and understand what their lives were. Why did they come? and then see the city in a sense through the eyes of not just women, but poor women. And a rich city like Bombay, which is supposed to be the financial capital of India, suddenly takes on a completely different, you look at it completely differently if you make that effort to understand what the poorest and the most marginalized in the poor are going through. So I wrote about that. That was one of the stories that I did, and that was my interest in urban issues, which finally led to my book on Dharavi. So the other half, which of course continued till 2016, was a wonderful opportunity for me, a space in which I could look at these issues. One of the other issues that for me, again, as a person writing on environment, you can write about forests, for instance, from all kinds of aspects and why they're important. And right now with climate change, they're carbon sinks and therefore they're needed. But the primary thing is the people who are dependent on the forest, right? The people who live there. And of these, in a way, the most crucial existence is that of the women, because it's the women who go out and collect the tendu leaves, they collect the other minor forest produce to sell. They're the ones who collect the firewood. So when forests recede, when the timber lobby comes and just completely destroys the forest, it means you're not only destroying the lives of poor people who are dependent, but you're increasing the workload of women that much more. And when you increase that workload, you also impact their health. There's a whole cycle of things that happen that goes around what seems only the destruction of a forest. So if you understand that, there is a way of telling that story where you bring that out, so that it is not just a matter of, how much tree cover does the state have, how much percentage of forest loss has there been, etc., etc. The kind of stories that you normally do. But you can use that data to actually illustrate what it means in the lives of people if you're aware of how gender operates in this. The same thing goes with infrastructure. I mean, again, in a city like Bombay, one of the big issues has always been housing for the urban poor. And every government comes up with schemes that are laid out and often fail miserably. This crucial question has always been that, are the women being consulted? And quite often they're not. So for instance, the standard scheme at the moment in Bombay is what is called the slum redevelopment scheme, which means that a slum area can be cleared. And if it's not needed for anything else, then a building can be built there or several buildings. And those are all 7 stories high. Now, so therefore from horizontal living, people are pushed up into vertical living. Now you would think that's okay because at least they have a toilet and it's a pakka house and they don't have to worry about demolition. But talk to the women. It's a very different perspective that they have. Because for one thing, no planning has been done for creating open spaces, which are so important for women, even if they're just outside their houses, when they have horizontal living. When you have vertical living, there's hardly any open space. There's only a narrow corridor. The advantage again of open spaces and horizontal living is there are many eyes that watch what goes on. So that creates a sense of safety. So if your child goes out, even if you can't see her, somebody else will, So if children are playing, there are other people who are watching. And if a stranger enters, many people will watch and notice. In a building, nobody knows. If your child down to play in between the space between buildings, either you have to go down yourself and leave your work and watch, or you just have to trust that nothing happens. And of course, many things do happen, So many people who have worked on urban planning have argued that if this whole plan to resettle slum dwellers had been done in consultation with communities and particularly women, it would have been possible to still maintain the density, but create a kind of housing that incorporates, the kind of lives that they had and the horizontal living that they had, plus creating, security and pakka houses and hygiene and health and all the other things that we would like people to have. But unfortunately, this has become the norm now. And now it's actually worse because now land prices have gone up. So again, there are now towers going up, of 20 floors. And the outgoing for the poor in terms of maintenance for these buildings is huge. Many of them can't afford it. So what is happening is as soon as they can, they sell their places. This has happened in many parts of Bombay and they go back to living in another slum. And so this is a story of infrastructure. Similarly, sanitation. I mean, for a long time, I have argued that sanitation is a women's issue. You know, men can shit and pee anywhere they like. I'm sorry for the crude term, but it's true. In India, especially, you know, you turn every corner and you see them. But women can't, you know, and women have to wait until dark before they can go out. In cities, it's absolutely impossible because there is no uninhabited area, especially in a city like Bombay. I found even when I traveled in UP, for instance, near Varanasi, in Mirzapur, the women living in the informal settlements there had the same problem. They were saying they have to walk a long way before they can get to a place where there's a little bit of privacy, where they can, defecate, because there are no toilets for them. Of course, now there's all these government schemes, but you know, we are now a 75-year-old independent country, and the fact that something like this has only occurred so late, to me, is an indication of the complete absence of understanding why sanitation is so important for women, why it's so important for girls. We know for a fact that there have been dropouts of girls from schools because schools did not have toilets. And once girls reach puberty, they cannot, you know, the parents don't want them to go to those schools because what will they do if there's no toilets? So sanitation is another one. I'm hoping now, after the farmers' agitation protest, and of course today they're all packing up and being in the wonderful scenes on social media showing, you know, the joyous celebrations of them packing up and leaving. I'm hoping at least now to register that the woman is a farmer, you know. Otherwise, the image of the farmer was always male, and even the farmers' protest, of course, has been largely male. But we know for a fact that 60% of agricultural work is actually done by women. And I think it's about time that we in the media and journalists also found ways of writing about this so that it registers with readers, with people in their consciousness, that agriculture is not just a male profession. Actually, it is rooted in the work that women do. So I give you these examples. I think many of you will be already familiar with them, but this is for me the way in which I began to understand. One more example I'll do, and that is natural disasters. Now, once again, in a natural disaster, of course, both men, women, and children are killed when there's an earthquake or there's a tsunami. And you would think, what can be a gender dimension to that? But actually, there is always a very clear dimension. I saw that in the earthquake in Bhuj, for instance, which took place in 2001. And, there were villages that were completely flattened. I've never seen anything like that before. And we got there just a week after the earthquake, because before that, those who were not based in Gujarat could not reach Kutch. So the first flight that went from Bombay, we were 7 or 8 of us journalists who managed to get onto it, along with some relief supplies, and went around. And it was, as I said, it was something that you can't forget. But even there, I tried to talk to some of the women because, you know, automatically it was the men who would come forward. If you go to a village, the men would come and describe to you what happened and so on. And the women would be lurking somewhere in the back. And you had to make a conscious effort to go out and talk to the women. One very interesting thing that came out, which had never occurred to me because I didn't know much about Gujarat and the society there. Many of the women would first ask me, they'd ask me my name, which I would give. And then they'd say, "Tumhari jati kya hai?" And I would say, "Jati?" You know, I'd say, "Tumhara ghar ekdam khatam ho gaya hai, tum mujhe jati ke bare mein baat kar rahe ho?" And, you know, I used to get a little irritated. But then later I thought about it, you know, and I thought, when society is mediated so deeply by caste, in a way, even as journalists, when we go and talk to people, people have to understand who we are and establish who we are. You know, they know that we are from a city. And maybe this question is an automatic one which comes. Rather than taking offense, I should have understood. And it's only a year later that I fully understood it, because when I went back to see what had been done about the rehabilitation for the earthquake, I saw that even there were separate Dalit colonies and there were separate upper caste colonies, even in the rebuilt villages. The other thing that I saw was that in the design of the houses, there was no consultation with the women. So a year after their houses had been built, they had set up tents outside the house in which they cooked, because the kind of kitchen that they were given was completely unsuitable for the fuel that they used, which was wood. And it was built hope that at some point they'd get cooking gas. Maybe they've got it now, but certainly in 2002, they did not have it. And there again, it emphasized for me that even after natural disaster, when you know that whatever you do in terms of construction of new places, the women are central to it and you must consult them, especially about location of the toilet, the kitchen. No such consultation took place. So all these big corporate houses came in and were benefactors and gave money, and these shining new houses were built with all the earthquake resistance features, but something so simple as how the kitchen should be designed, the voice of the woman was not taken. And I wrote about it, and I think these are the kind of things we can write about, and we can continually emphasize that there is a very specific factor that has to do with gender. Others have written about the tsunami, for instance, similarly, that apparently when Oxfam did a survey, they found that many more women had died. And one of the reasons was in Tamil Nadu was because when the waves came, the women could not get away fast enough because of the clothes they wore, and they couldn't climb up to these trees or higher places to escape the waves. And that's an interesting angle too that you don't think about when you write about the tsunami, because the tsunami destroyed so much and killed so many people. So these are just some of the examples. I'm sure all of you have many more examples, because many of you are reporting from areas that I have certainly not reported from. And the Population First Fellowship actually is a wonderful opportunity to figure out ways in which we can write stories that integrate the gender perspective into our reporting, but also find new ways of doing it, which I was talking about earlier. So I think the tendency still is that if we want to write from a gender perspective, we must write about women. And I think this is the thing that I would strongly urge that we rethink, So for instance, during this COVID time, it's very good that there have been so many articles about the ASHA workers, and certainly they are workers who are so invisible in all other times, that it's very good that there were reports that brought out their central role in providing care during this period. But, it became almost like a cliche then with many reports that were automatic. You wrote about the ASHA worker. In the fellowships this time, I noticed that at least one person has written about the mental health problems that the ASHA workers faced. I think that's very interesting, because then you don't see them merely as the providers of healthcare, the essential workers, but you see them as human beings, as individual women who the kind of problems they face taking on this kind of work in their homes, the kind of pressures they face anyway, because they're not appreciated enough, and you give a human face to what is a very legitimate story. I would say the same thing about the uptick in domestic violence. I think people's eyes just glaze over if you just write a story with statistics about domestic violence. And what does it actually mean? How does it translate itself into a woman's life? So I think those kind of stories, to make any kind of impact, you have to work really hard to at least find one survivor who will speak to you, even if she does it without giving her name and specifics. Because it's the stories of the survivors that really bring home to us the reality of domestic violence. You can read any amount of about it, but you meet somebody who has survived or is struggling to survive. I think those stories, certainly for me, whatever I have written and whatever I have heard, they still haunt me, because, to think of women, especially at this COVID times, when they're locked up into these tiny homes with their husbands, with the children, and often in an abusive relationship. I can now visualize it, because in other times I have talked to these women and known that even when they were not locked up in this way, the kind of problems they had in trying to reach help, in trying to get away. And in this, one of the interesting stories, which I think was in this lot of fellowships, was the fact that, for instance, in Kashmir, maybe it was another story that I read also, in Kashmir on August 5th, when Article 370 was abrogated, one of the outcomes was that, things like the Women's Commission that was there, where women could turn if they were in distress, that was wound up. And there was nothing else in its place. So women who were suffering from domestic violence, even the few state structures that existed that they could have turned to, were not available. So I think that's a very interesting angle, to bring out, because it links in with the politics of the place. It's not something in isolation. You don't just write about the fact that women, because they're locked up, they're suffering from domestic violence, but the additional factor of the politics of that area that has exacerbated the situation that they're in. I'll just mention a couple of other stories. I've read some of the past ones, and I've read some of the English ones in this one, in this lot of fellowships. And there were several really good stories that I was very impressed with. For instance, I mentioned the one about mental health. I think Purvi Gupta has written that. I thought that was a very good piece. And there was another one about a woman's sarpanch, which I thought was a very interesting one, because it was very realistic. It wasn't trying to, make it into a story, a good news story, without giving the problems that occur. Similarly, I think Jyoti Yadav from Print has done some really interesting stories, particularly about the pad bank, looking at menstruation. These are, for me, examples of how you take up an issue that is always there, but find a way of writing about it that is different. Similarly, KK Shahina, has done a very important piece on abortion, on the abortion law. And that even though it has changed, and now you don't have to give the name of the husband, you can give the name of the partner, how in fact it doesn't get implemented even in a progressive state like Kerala. I can mention these other stories later, maybe when we talk. Let me stop here. And let me just say one more thing. This book, I know it comes the other way around, so I don't know quite how to do it so that you see it. Missing half the story, gender as a journalism as if gender matters, which Population First Commission, and which I edited, I think still is a very good book for anyone who wants to get an idea. And maybe Population First, Sharda, maybe we should think of reissuing this, because I think it's a good text for any journalist who wants to. And sorry to push my own book, but this is the book that I've written at the end of 2019, The Silence in the Storm, Narratives of Violence Against Women. And the only reason I'm showing this to you is because it's based on my journalism. It's based on my writing on gender through these years, and where I've looked even at violence from the perspective that it's not just the sexual assault that is violence. I do believe that developmental policy, environmental policy that disregards the burdens that women carry, that disregard patriarchy, that disregard the lowly status of women in our society, that disregard the triple burden that poor women who are also Dalit face. I think the kind of violence they experience, that is to do with these policies, and that is not to do only with sexual assault. And I think governments and people who talk about women's empowerment must understand that to make any difference. So this book is also written with that in mind, to try and argue for those issues. So let me stop here, Sharda, and maybe we can, if people have questions, what I really like is if they can ask me the question so I can also see their faces. If they raise their hands, then it's much more like a conversation rather than just in the chat box. Is that possible?
Yep.
Sharda, you're muted.
Yeah, please raise your hand, and then you can ask your question, or you can if you have a comment also, you can share, or if you want to share an experience also, please feel free to talk.
Yeah, in fact, tell me about the problems you faced also in trying to do some stories from a gender.
Just now, yeah, you can unmute and
introduce yourself, please, also.
Hi, good afternoon, ma'am. That was really an amazing session. I'm Jyotsna Kaur Habibullah from Lucknow. So I run an organization working with farmers and startup entrepreneurs, but I do a lot of work on gender also. So this is a question that I'm struggling to get an answer with, because how much has changed that you see in the representation of stories about men and women, in mainstream news? For instance, how they cover the men's cricket team and how they cover the women's cricket team, men in business, women in business. What do you see is the change that's happened, and how can we bring a larger change?
That's a good question. Actually, when I think about 50 years, of course, there has been a change. The major change, I think, has been just in terms of numbers. There are many more women now who are writing. They're not necessarily writing from a gender perspective, but they're there. They're there in the newsrooms. They're there in some decision making, not always. So I think that has had some kind of impact. The other impact has been, I think, the women's movement in the 80s, I think, did create an awareness of a lot of issues amongst journalists also and in the media. Many of the women who are part of the women's movement started writing edit page articles, but still, at least their voices were heard in the media. So I think that has changed. The campaigning by women's groups, including women journalists, we had a group in Bombay which started with many of us working in mainstream media. And we, within our own organizations, took up issues such as sexist headlines, the use of the term Eve. And so we talked to our friends who were on the desk and fought that these things go. So I find now, compared to, Amu Joseph and I did a study of women's issues in the media in the 90s. If I look back at that book, I find that actually many of those things that we had objected to, there used to always be a third edit in most English language newspapers, which was always very sexist. It was humor at the cost of women. Many of the cartoons were also quite often done with absolutely no gender sensitivity. So I think those kind of obvious things have gone. There's an effort now not to use pronouns that, so that automatically every doctor, every politician, every farmer is a him. At least an effort is made to say him, her, or, he, she, or her, so that it's... So I think those changes have come about. But I would say, as I said earlier, I think the problem now is that the preoccupation of the media is to sell. Market is king. So whatever sells is what is news now. So women are in the news if what they have done or what they're doing or what they haven't even done, as in the case of Riya Chakravarti. That is news because it'll sell your paper. It'll draw TRPs to your channel. Whereas the kind of news we are talking about, the kind of stuff that really affects people, because poverty has vanished from our urban newspapers. Because, I was told when I worked with one of the newspapers that our readership is not interested in reading about poverty. So there is no need to write so much about poverty. This is the transformation that has taken place, where news has been commodified to sell the product, the brand. And when that happens, then I'm afraid that all these things that we've talked about go out of the window, So they may not be open misogyny of the kind that we saw, but there certainly is in the way in which certain aspects are treated. And, I think the Riya Chakravarti case last year is a case in point, The way the media treated that woman and the story shows you that where have we moved to, if this is what it comes down to. And even now, there are more women in politics, there are more spokespersons, women are there. But even now, one has to fight all the time to remind people that, you can have a panel discussion where there's no need to have all men. There are women who are equally competent. That battle hasn't gone still. And there are still meetings that I go to where I have to raise my hand and remind people about gender, about the fact that, these aspects need to be taken into account. Yeah, so the more things change, sometimes the more they remain the same.
Yeah, anyone else? The fellows who are attending the session, would you like to say something?
We have Shahida Murtaza. Shahida, would you like to ask your questions? I've sent you a request to unmute and ask the question, please.
Who's that?
Henri
Shahid?
has a question too.
Shahida Murtaza.
Hi, hi, hi. I was just traveling and we supposed of your lecture. I don't know whether you remember looking at my face. We traveled together. Amu and me traveled together, but we were there maybe in Kerala or Bombay. I don't remember. Travel all the way. Anyway, yeah. So we used to refer your book. You know that we teach women in journalism at PG here in Hyderabad.
Yes.
So I don't know what all you must have spoken. It's so wonderful, madam, listening to you. Other day when I was in Aligarh, we were discussing about town planning and gender aspects. The way you were talking about when I go to market or village to women to pee, or for the men, it is everywhere. Why don't the planning, government in planning center, why don't they think of, like should be some women who can really think from our perspective and design such things, when I get down from the bus or anywhere, you see that in the way of a long journey, we don't have any toilets at all. Or if we have old, there's no question of old men or handicapped. Like I was traveling the other day to Goa, on the way I got down, there was no toilet which you can use because Western toilet was missing. Even if it is there, sometimes it is like that, they never thought of. This is one thing I felt that the government should look into and then decide about it. Only you people, I mean, when women are in journalism, can raise such issue. Second thing, madam, I don't know whether you have already spoken about. I have been taking up the work of, stick or you see the glass. How to visualize the whole issue of women not being many in journalism, they say because of the hawk-eye of the men around. There is a lot of, glass ceiling. Yeah, can you just put some light on?
I am not sure I got the last one, but on the missing toilets,
Glass ceiling.
On the glass
For
ceiling.
women.
Yeah. So to take your first thing about the missing toilets, let me tell you, that is something that women journalists can talk a lot about, because all of us who've gone out reporting, we have learned how to survive by sipping water, eating dry biscuits and bananas. And because sometimes you can go almost an entire day. I went on a reporting assignment to Rajasthan and came back with a UTI, simply because I didn't drink enough water and I didn't find toilets to go to. I came back here to Bombay, and this is what I was diagnosed with. I thought I got some flu, but it turned out to be a UTI. So this is something we live with, and actually it's not changed, And I think maybe we also didn't talk about it enough or fight about it enough. And I'm hoping a younger generation of women journalists will take it up. But Swachh Bharat and all is fine, but actually the ST stands, I mean, I travel by ST buses all over Maharashtra. I can tell you, I don't think that has changed much in terms of the toilet availability. As far as the glass ceiling is concerned, again, I go back to the fact that the structure of the media has changed, and now it's the owners and money that speaks. So if there are women who are willing, or men who are willing to go along with that, then they have a chance of moving up. But quite often women are not prepared to do so, and they have to pay a price. And also I think a lot of owners who are men, not all owners are men, but many are, they feel uncomfortable with a woman editor, and particularly if she's independent minded. So you find that generally many women have risen to deputy editor, associate editor, but still in our mainstream newspapers, mostly men are editors. There have been a few exceptional ones. And quite often those exceptions are women who are part of the family that owns the newspaper. Like the Hindu where I work, Malini Parthasarathy is also an owner, and she was also an editor. So it is difficult. I don't think that has changed. I think it's breaking. And the other thing I found amongst my colleagues is many of them had to just give up working full time, because you either are caregivers for parents, or you have family and other commitments, and the pressure is always there still on the woman to take the break in her career and sit back. And it's very difficult to then re-enter. So the result is that many women become columnists, or they, be independent journalists. And that has become even more difficult today because the spaces for writing are more difficult. Pitching for stories. Younger journalists have the energy where they pitch all over the place, and they also figure out how to write for many foreign publications so they can make up the difference and write for a few Indian publications. But it's much tougher. In fact, it's almost impossible to survive only on freelancing now. You have to, if you have a fallback, you can survive, but it's difficult. And the glass ceiling, I don't see in the near future that being broken, frankly. I don't think so. I don't think it's in the interests of media owners to encourage that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kalpana. Thank you. There was a question. There I can really raise the issue of Me Too, where journalists could have taken it further and then decided about, to teach like sort of we had Akbar, taught a lesson. And the same way, Tahlika. Like that, there are many places, houses of media where we require women to be in more number. Because of this type of behavior, I don't think women are encouraged to go and then join as journalists. If they are there, the women issues can be addressed in a proper way, truly speaking. The Me Too died too soon.
No, I don't know whether it's died. I mean, it may be just quiet at the moment. But I think what it has done is that I think it's very clear that at least from my interaction with younger women journalists, that they're not willing to tolerate many of the things that we put up with, And I think the men also, the younger men, are far more aware now because this has been talked about so much, and that there have been these cases. So there's been a plus for that. And I think that's why I'm saying the numbers matter. If you have a lot of women there in the workspace, the culture of that workspace changes, irrespective of whether they all agree politically or not, that doesn't matter. But the sheer presence of so many women covering everything from sport to politics to defense to economics, business, etc., makes a difference. And that has happened. And I think that's a very positive development that has happened.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
We now have Anuradha wanting to ask a question. So Anuradha, please unmute and just ask your question now.
You can hear me? Am I audible? Yeah.
Hi, Anuradha.
Yeah, hello, Kalpana. And thank you, Dr. Sharda. Very, very interesting session. And I totally agree with all that you have said. It's just a comment. We have been writing and we have been reporting, and you said some pertinent things now, but I just wanted to understand, are men really sensitized? What has been the impact? I mean, seriously, I my father, my husband, my son, etc., everybody, I closer home, I can understand, but the larger picture, all the pertinent issues that have been raised, how do we survey, how do we understand the impact on this group? I just thought I'd ask that. Thanks.
So, Anuradha, first of all, let me say that one of the stories you did, I do read you in Indian Express. That's my first paper and my first loyalty from the old times when I worked with it, on the women who had, were visually impaired. And that story I thought was a really innovative way of looking at something. When I was saying about, finding angles that are unusual, that also bring in gender, I think that's a very good example. And maybe, after I've talked to you, maybe you can even tell the others what that story was, because I don't think it was part of this fellowship, was it?
Yes,
previous year.
Yeah,
it was 2020.
Yeah.
So, about changing changing attitudes, I think, as I said, I think the whole thing of gender has to be located within the political economy of our countries, And I feel what's happened within the politics and the economy of this country is that it's gone more and more towards me, narcissism, self-gratification, the consumer economy, people have closed in on not only me, but my clan, my community. And so it'll be my women that I will look after, and that's it. You don't think of. So even amongst men, if you say to them, oh, you're insensitive, they say, no, of course not. My daughter, I have permitted her to do whatever she wants. And, that's still, even with younger men, they'll say, no, but I help my wife in the house, And I think it's true. Many of them do what our fathers maybe did not do, But that's not real change. That's not accepting equality between men and women, So I think the way I analyze it, that patriarchy remains untouched in India. In fact, rather than being dismantled, it's being reinforced by the politics in our country, which has become very masculine, and with the aggression that you see. I mean, it's toxic. It's a masculine aggression that you see on the streets, the lynching, everything is this kind of aggression. That is one thing, and the economy. And I think the economy has also made people far more self-centered, thinking of themselves rather than the community, than the welfare of the larger. So we don't see poverty. We would much rather not see it. I mean, I know you're in Pune. I live in Bombay. Bombay has always been a mixed, all localities just have all kinds of people living. And in Bombay, to have gated communities is really strange, because it didn't happen. I mean, it's true, there were Saraswat Brahmins living here, there were Parsis living here, there were Gujaratis living here, etc. But they were not cut off from everybody else, So that is my analysis. So within that, if you look at gender, then gender, one dimension is the me dimension, which has come out with, say, Me Too, for instance. It's very much what is happening to me. But I think luckily the parallel dimension is coming in the politics. And the two examples I'll give you are the anti-CA NRC, because that was very much of a women's, they were the ones who were right in the front. And they were fighting for, they were fighting for citizenship, which is, I think, very important. That they were saying, we women, we are citizens, And I think that something has registered in that, And the other thing I think is the whole farmers movement, because even though the imagery from television was mainly men, we know for a fact that a lot of women were central to it. They took up leadership positions. And certainly in Maharashtra, I mean, women are very much part of the, the whole movement of farmers here, and in Tamil Nadu, and in many other states. And I think the media doesn't bring that out enough. But I think that has been a factor. And I think lastly, even in politics, with the 50% reservation for women in panchayats, I think now we have many more women who are politically conscious. They may still find it very difficult to get ahead in the main political parties. But I think at the municipal level, at the ward level, at the panchayat level, you are seeing more women out there. And whether men like it or not, these women are there. They are taking decisions, So it's a long haul for things to change. But I think the media certainly can play a much bigger role than it does. I mean, there's no question. I think if there was a concerted and a conscious effort made, A, to recruit many more women so that they are there in your face, they're doing the reporting, and B, to bring into journalism, right from journalism school, an understanding of gender, an understanding of patriarchy, an understanding of our society, so that we integrate it into the way we write, what we write about, how we report. I do believe that, something will start penetrating.
Absolutely. I just wanted to add one comment. It's just an observation that I had during the pandemic, if I may allow to just take 2 minutes. I have a lawyer friend, and in the pandemic, she's really made money. And the money she's made is because the divorces that has increased. Women are very, very smart. They don't want to stay with people. I mean, very toxic kind of husbands. There are examples which probably I'll talk about it later whenever we have the time. But is this a way of hitting out against all this male chauvinism? Is that the solution? I'm a little, I'm still of the old guard that, okay, you have to get married, you stay, you adjust, etc., etc. But what is this? I mean, I'm a little clueless on that front, I mean, why so many divorces? I still am going to explore that story subsequently, but I just thought I'd raise that.
No, that's a good story. And maybe the other one you could explore is why, again, women who are professional in jobs, Many of them are getting married much later or not getting married at all. I'm a single woman. One of the books I've done is Single by Choice, which I've edited. And I have, I know many women in their 50s, late 40s. They're not the least bit interested in marriage. And they're consciously choosing, they're saying, unless it's really value addition, why should we go in for it?
Absolutely.
So that is another story which I think needs to be explored much more.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
We now have Shelly asking her question. And thank you, Anuradha, for that great set of questions.
Hello, am I audible? Hello.
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Hi, ma'am. I am Shelly. I'm from Bombay. I am 19 years old, soon to be 20. It was a lovely session. I think I heard a lot of new perspectives towards how I thought about feminism and, to issues that I was not aware of. And I just wanted to add my own observation that I've had in the past 19 years that I've lived. And that is, so I have a first cousin who's a boy, and the kind of behavior that like our parents do with me versus him is just very sad. I would tell you why, because like he is given permission for stuff that I would not be permitted for. My location would be tracked at all times. I would be asked 50 questions, whereas he just has to answer 5. And I think that whole I'm currently working, and I don't see so much of sexist behavior at my job and like at my internship, but the amount of sexist behavior that I get from my family is just so much more than people who I meet outside. So I think till the time it's not gonna like get out of that generation and the type of thinking that they have, I think it's not really going to make a change. I have started hating male as a gender so much because of the injustice that I saw in my own family. Is one of the reasons that it turned me gay, and I am a very known gay activist now who would be all for feminism, because I just can't stand men. And to make such a decision at the age of 20, and I think it's really sad.
Well, Shelly, you're very brave. What can I say? I mean, all men are not bad. Let me say that. There are men who are feminists, and I know many. And it's very difficult to change people. That also I'll tell you from my old age. But I think we mustn't give up. I refuse to be a pessimist.
Honestly, I'll tell you,
I've been through very rough times as a journalist during the emergency. And in mainstream media, it's always been a battle where I've worked most of my life. But I still refuse to be a pessimist, because I do believe that if you give up, throw up your hands and say, kuch nahi ho sakta, much worse will happen. Whereas if you say, Acha, at least this I will do. Let me do this. I do believe that incremental change can take place if enough people say, I will not tolerate this and I will try and change this. It's difficult. I know nobody says it's easy, but it's many more of us have to fight for that change. And it's not enough to just, it's a personal choice. You have perfectly good reasons not to like men, and I appreciate that completely. But I think it goes beyond that. It goes beyond men. It is our society. It's the patriarchal setup in our families that leads to what you're describing about the difference between the way you were treated and your cousin was treated. That is the thing we have to dismantle. We have to find ways of dismantling it. If we can't do it with the existing families, at least what we create as our communities and our families, we must make sure that we don't fall into the same trap, creating the same hierarchies and the same kind of, structures that are essentially patriarchal.
You're right. I think, but yet, like there are stats that prove saying that, because I think I've not yet met such type of men for me to like them. Definitely open to them, definitely would love to hang out with them. Like currently I'm traveling with my Uber guy and I would die to talk to him if he has perspectives and views for it. But like, if you see 90% of people who are attending this particular session are also women. So if those 10% people happen to be men that are going to have perspectives like me, like yours, then I'm all in for it. But I've deeply had this hate for them, which I want to get over, which will only happen if I happen to meet people like, as you said, good men. So let's hope that happens.
Yeah, let's hope so. Shelly, thank you.
Thank you.
We have Alhamra Khan now. Only thing is that I don't see her mic. Maybe she has to select an audio option. So would you do that, please, so I can unmute you and you can ask your question? Ms. Khan, can you hear me? You'll have to add an audio connection. And while you're doing that, maybe we'll just go to Mr. Bhartesh Thakur then. Please go ahead and ask your question, Bhartesh.
Am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Ma'am, you just said that do not report the obvious.
Yeah.
Ma'am, and you have also talked about domestic violence. So,
Yeah.
ma'am, what are the different aspects where we can focus as far as domestic violence is concerned? Because a lot has been written about it also.
Yeah. So, there is, as I said, in fact, something like domestic violence does require to be told as a story from the point of view of at least one individual, because, as a journalist, that people read the stories that are humanized, right? And so even if you give the data about domestic violence, the fact that there's been an uptick, unless it's presented in a way that also, talks about one person that you have as a reporter actually gone and spoken to. I know that for guys, it is more difficult. And I think the women who are abused would feel more comfortable talking to a woman than they would to a man. So I understand that completely. It's very difficult to get the human interest story. But I think the human interest angle to many of these issues does make a difference. So I think you have to figure out a way of getting that into your story. And
I attempted a story on the sexual abuse within marriage, and I relied on a totally different data set where we talked about the cases registered by the women for unnatural act by the husbands, because
right. I read that story of yours. Yeah. I think I read that. The story that I read of yours about women being vaccinated less than men, right? Was that your story?
It was my story.
Yeah. Okay, so it was good. I mean, again, that was known. It's known that generally women have, but I think what was missing from it was the context. It wasn't clear from your story why that was so. And I think if you could have found a way of bringing in the fact that, see, basically women are socialized to neglect their health. You know that within families, they don't talk about their health till it reaches a critical point. And then they have to be rushed to hospital and, and so on, because they're told not to, they're always worrying about everybody else's health except their own. And they're not, and if they do talk too much, then they're told, you're whining and why you're making such a racket about your health. So I think it's possible that the same thing extends to something like vaccination, where the women would have thought, well, let everybody else get it and let's see, So it would be interesting to explore that a little more, because it's not a direct connection, but because it is connected with health, it's possible that there is this dimension of the way women are socialized not to think about health. So I thought in your story, if something of that could have come out, it would have been interesting. The story that you did on the on these on unnatural sex and so on was again different. I mean, that's something that one doesn't read about. So that was an interesting. I think you had something on child pregnancy.
Here I focus on the cases. I focus on the victims of sexual assault who are disabled also, who are physically challenged. Like one was visually impaired.
Yeah.
So I focus on those cases and how they suffered because of COVID. They couldn't get the abortion done because the process is very cumbersome also.
Yes, yeah. Now that was a good one. Again, that was an interesting angle. I mean, I was happy to read that because again, I think one reads on these issues, but you don't necessarily get that kind of angle. So I think that is a good thing that you got. What was the second question you asked apart from domestic violence?
Ma'am, what are the other aspects where we can focus and which you think they are still unexplored?
Yeah, well, one big area. Are you based in Haryana?
I'm based. Yes, I'm based in Chandigarh, ma'am.
Chandigarh, okay. So one big story that's going to come up now is climate change.
Okay.
Because internationally it's there, whether we like it or not. In India, it's going to be a big story. And I think from the gender perspective, it has not been explored enough. But climate change is not just something that happens up there. It manifests itself in all kinds of ways. So, the way our cities are planned, I don't Chandigarh, of course, is a modern city, but, like Bombay, for instance, when there is flooding, and now there's going to be more flooding because of, the change in the weather patterns, because of the rise in the sea levels, and the low-lying areas are where the poor live. So they are going to be more affected, and amongst them, women, because quite often it's the women who are doing home-based work, so they need their home is also their place of work. And so if they lose that, they lose even the little space they get within their families because they're bringing home an income. The same with farming. With the change in weather patterns, the small and marginal farmers are the ones who are going to be affected the most. And amongst them, it's going to be, again, women, which we have to look at. So I think there are many angles. And in the hilly regions, again, there are stories of these landslides and, where houses are built and how it's affected, again, the poorer people. But I don't find there's enough writing in our media on looking at climate change from all these different perspectives. So I think that is one very big one to follow through. And I think the second one is post-COVID. I mean, there will be a post-COVID, I hope. And now that health is so much a part of, what we're talking about, I think we do have to look at why, why are we getting these statistics about anemia, for instance, in women? That's actually gone up. I mean, we have to do stories to find out, what is the reason? I know what the reason is. It is poverty, and women are just not getting enough to eat. And still the whole system of women eating the least and last continues in most families. But I think we have to write about it. I think these are the issues that we must pick out and write about. Similarly about children and stunting. And the third thing is about, I think, the dropout rate amongst girls. I think some stories were written that because of online learning, often it's the girl child who was not encouraged to continue. And if there's one phone, it was given to the boy. But I think more of such stories should come out. There are dimensions to the post-COVID story that I think need to be taken forward in terms of health and women's health particularly. We should look at that. And fourth thing, let me say that, in some states, I don't know in Haryana whether they've talked about this 2-child norm, but it's coming up in a number of the BJP ruled states.
Yeah, in panchayats, they are talking about it.
Yeah, so I think that is another thing of reproductive health and women, I think is a story that needs to be pursued because, we wrote a lot about it in the 80s and the 90s about women giving choice. The government made a commitment that there would be no force used. And yet the data was that basically still tubectomies and not vasectomies that are taking place. There are still stories that women are afraid to use contraceptives, or if they want to use it, they're not available. There's so many aspects of that story of reproductive health that has now been relegated to it's not there at all, in fact. And I think it should be, and I think also because, young girls and boys are getting much more sexually active. So I think, these stories are even more important. So I think these are things to be pursued and written about. And I think the more we write about them, the more awareness we will create if we do write about them.
Ma'am, one story I attempted on the elopement of minors is on rise in Haryana. The story was actually about the age of consent. So here, here the victims are both the boys and the girls, both. But there are a number of cases where the teenage girls, like who are 17 years old, who are 17 and a half years old, or they are 16-year-old, they refuse to go with their parents, and they choose to stay at shelter home, and they wait to turn to turn to 18 years, and so that they can get married to their boyfriend. So that was a story. In fact, Guardian also attempted the story, but they attempted the story from the boy's perspective. They did a story that how a boy is facing a rape case, and he can even face imprisonment of 20 years because his girlfriend has got pregnant. So I chose to reflect this version of the girls who are at the shelter homes and who are waiting to turn to 18 so that they can get out of that.
No, that's very interesting. Very interesting. Actually, I think the print had done a series also in which, of course, there it was more about these interfaith marriages in UP. But in that case also, I think a number of them were minors. And, the issue has come up. But this is a very interesting story. I had not read it. Where was it? In the Tribune?
It was in Tribune. It was
okay. Yeah.
Elopement of minor girls on rise in Haryana. That is you can find it on Google also.
Okay, excellent. Well, congratulations. I think you've done good stories, and I'm glad you've used this fellowship. And are you working with the Tribune, or are you?
I'm working with Tribune, ma'am. I'm in Haryana bureau.
Okay, great. Then you can just integrate this into your reporting now.
Thank you.
Bring out more and more stories. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why don't you do something on the farmers also, on the women farmers, because some of them.
I will do it. I will do it.
Yeah.
I will do it.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Bhartesh. And now we have a question from Manvi Pant. She's not able to speak because her net is poor. So her question is, can you recommend some resources that help us in using gender neutral reporting language and why it is important?
Yeah, okay. Manvi, this book, which I pointed out, Journalism as Gender Matters, has a whole section which has the kind of words that you can use. If we have a PDF of this, Sharda, maybe we can circulate it to at least the fellows and anybody else who wants to, because I think Lakshmi Murthy put it together. And
actually,
yeah. And there are, on the net there are.
Yeah, we have actually a whole lot of. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I said even on the net there are these resources, but I think this was done specifically with us in mind in India. So this might be a good. And it's very neat. It's not a very long thing. Very simple. The words that you can substitute. I think if you can put it up either on your website or somewhere where people can access it. Yeah.
It's already there on our website. We actually have a whole set of guidelines to report on sensitively on disability, on LGBTQI, and on gender and abortion, sex selection, what terms to use, what pictures to use, what not to say. So we have a whole lot of guidelines. So I'll be very happy to share the guidelines with all those who are attending today's session. We'll send it to you by email. We have your email IDs with us. So we'll send you the guidelines in a day or two.
Yeah, good.
Thank you very much for that. We now have Sudarshana Deb. She wants to ask you a question. So Sudarshana, would you please unmute and ask the question?
Sure, ma'am. Hi, ma'am. I'm Sudarshana, and I'm pursuing BGMC first year. And I have this very small question. Ma'am, somewhere I read it that there are 18 countries which has laws that give the liberty to the husbands that they can prevent their wives from working and being an independent woman. I just wanted to ask that even in this modern era, why women have to face these restrictions by laws, by the government?
So Darshana, I have no answer for that. I would ask you the same question. Why? Truly, I mean, we were discussing earlier how many things have changed. I think in many countries things have changed. I think, in India we have a lot of progressive laws that have come in, even if they're not implemented. But there are many more countries around the world where there's still very little movement on this, and that I'm afraid is a reality. In a new gender-just world, these things would not exist, and that is what we are all striving for. But the reality is that even in countries like ours, where we have laws which are pro-women, where we have politicians who are constantly talking, about the fact that they believe in gender empowerment, women's empowerment. The reality, as we know, as we've just discussed, is very different, that it's still, our systems are still very patriarchal. There is no real political will to even implement many of the laws that could make a big difference to the lives of women. And I think in every society, this is the thing. I think, civil society, people who believe in these issues have to just continue finding ways to go on fighting. It can't happen just with a directive from the top. There has to be constantly within society an upsurge and a demand for that kind of change. And then I think change does occur when there's a concurrence between what changes from the top and the demands that come in from the bottom. It doesn't happen with one or the other.
Does that answer your question, or do you have something more to ask us, Darshana?
Yes, ma'am. I have one more question. Like recently in Aurangabad, a brother beheaded his sister just because she married with her own will.
Yeah.
Like, and this topic wasn't much highlighted, I think. So why is like this?
Well, it was reported. I mean, I read it in the Indian Express and I think in a couple of other newspapers. And I think perhaps, I don't know, whether the Indian Express even may have had an editorial comment on it. I mean, it is shocking. And it's the worst end of, what we've been talking about. And, for a brother to do this to a sister is just scary that in this day and age, this happens. But, for every reported case, there might be many more that we don't even know about. That again is a reality that we have to realize that, boys are social, just as I was talking about women being socialized not to talk about themselves, not to talk about their problems, to always, hold back. Boys are socialized to assert their authority, to believe that they are right, to believe that, they can tell anybody, their mothers, their sisters, anyone, because they are men, they're boys. And I feel, I mean, this boy, I'm sure, has been brought up with that belief. And because the girl had the courage to just go out and do what she wanted, I think he felt it was his manly duty probably to just go and kill her. I mean, it's absurd in this day and age that people do this, but it's so base, this instinct of power and control, that with all the finesse that we have and all the modernity that we have, frankly, many of these things have not changed all that much as we think they have, and it's not just in a particular class. You find it, in the upper classes, there's all this, it's all covered in a different kind of aura, but underneath is the same instinct of wanting to control and wanting to tell women what their place is.
Manvi, I have one, I mean, I can feel your angst, and I can feel your shock, and I know you're very young, and then this is something, which you will find unbearable or unthinkable, but that is how the world is, and we can make a difference. I'm very optimistic. The fact that you're thinking and you're finding it shocking is good enough, is good enough for you to motivate yourself to do something about it in your own life, in your community's life, in your family's life. And as I say, change comes in small increments. And then if we all decide to make a difference, we can make a difference. And I would request to understand this whole issue of gender, patriarchy, and other things. I request you to please register for our upcoming workshop, which is on gender and patriarchy, creating sensitivity about gender and patriarchy for journalists. So I'll send you the link when we finalize the date and time. And please do join that workshop. That will give you a greater understanding of how patriarchy works, how sexism works, how, this whole definition of feminine, masculine, and how it constricts or how it stops us from being more compassionate and more complete human beings. So please do join us for that workshop. And I'm very glad that you have asked the question. It's very important to ask the question, to have a conversation on these issues, because that is what starts the process of change. Thank you so much. So, yep.
We have a question by Jyoti Karmakar. So I'm going to unmute her and maybe she can ask the question herself. Jyoti, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi.
Great.
Hi. I am a mentor to some students, and they're all first and second year students. They're just not aware of all these problems, or nobody tells them these stories. Are there any websites or any social media handles that we can just send it to them on a regular basis? Because I find it very difficult for them. They don't read the newspaper and they don't read the news on, their mobiles. They just want to see fashion and music. So I'm just requesting for some lead as to make them aware about the problems that they can and will face once they start working also, and how to handle gender inequality. Reading is a big problem.
Yeah, well, Jyoti, if reading is a problem, then that's the problem about giving them these resources, because will they read them, So
it's such a catch-22.
It's a catch-22, because, the thing about any kind of consciousness, whether it's about human rights or about environment or about gender, you got to want it, right? Then you seek it out, seek out the information. But if you're not even aware, if you're not even, you're completely not conscious of it, then to poke them to think about it is the first step. And only then will they go to the next step of actually wanting to reach out. So you can give them the resources, and you should, but that there's no guarantee. And, I teach journalism sometimes. The first question I ask my students is, how many of you read the newspaper this morning? So out of a class of 50, like 3 hands will go up. And then I say, well, where are you getting your news from? And they all look at their phones and they say, in shorts. So that is how they get it. And these are journalism students, So I despair, because if you're not reading when you want to be a journalist, how are you going to read if you're not even a journalist, So this generation doesn't read, their information comes from all kinds of, and they think they're very well informed. That's the other thing. So that curiosity, or that, I always said journalism, it doesn't matter that I've been a journalist now for almost 50 years. There's still so many things I don't know. My approach to every story is I don't know. That's the only way I can do a story, because then I'll ask the questions. If I go into a story saying I know, then there's no story, because I'm not asking questions. So that questioning, and our education system in this country has killed curiosity.
Yeah,
it is actually deterred even the students who want to ask questions are seen as a nuisance if they ask questions,
Right.
It's not encouraging a questioning environment. Our families don't encourage questioning.
Yeah, because the family has never encouraged it.
And schools don't encourage questioning, and universities don't encourage questioning. So then you get a whole generation of, people who just take in. I mean, now with social media giving all this nonsense, so much fake stuff, it astounds me that perfectly intelligent people can look at something and not even say, is this true? Can this be true? Even that one question doesn't arise in their mind.
Yeah.
They see it and they say, oh my gosh, this has happened, and forward it. How can people who call themselves educated do this, and yet they're doing it? Yeah, so it's a challenge. I wish you all the best. Find some innovative way.
Thank you. I mean, we'll take it one step. I'm taking it one step at a time, And COVID has really created more havoc, The newspapers only used to sit down and have their lunch. Well, thank you so much, Kalpana. I've enjoyed this session, and I must also thank Sharda for including me in this entire thing. Thank you.
Most welcome, Jyoti. Kalpana, I have one. I want you to talk about one, topic. Recently, the NFHS data has come out. Many times, many reports come, like the World Population Report, the status of world children, then the NFHS, census, economic survey, name it. Every 2 months, 3 months, there is a report coming. But I don't see much writing on the reports, except saying this report is there in 2-3 points. For instance, this NFHS report is so very controversial. There are so much that can be written about, So can you guide the participants here how to use those reports and, give an insight to the readers about, rather than just giving the data, but an insight into what a certain, data is indicating about the social reality or what is happening or the change process. So I think this is very, very important. I feel very disappointed when I don't see much in-depth reporting on these very, very important data sources.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned that earlier to Bhatesh also, that, the thing is, it's a national level survey, but I think there's a state-wise data that's available if you go to the website. So it would be very interesting to see, for instance, in Maharashtra or Tamil Nadu or Haryana, in each of these states or wherever the journalists come from, what has happened with, I was giving anemia as one instance, for instance, anemia in women, where overall it's gone up. So it would be interesting to see state-wise. And then the way I would do the story is I would certainly talk to the regional health people, but then I would go to an area, like for instance, in Maharashtra, there are certain tribal areas which are not very far from either Bombay or Pune, where from my own memory of journalism, I mean, in 1984, I wrote about healthcare in some of these areas, which had not reached. And every now and then I keep reading stories about that same area where the still problems continue. A pregnant woman who died because she had to be carried, for many kilometers on a bed sheet to the nearest center, and then by the time they got her to where she could get help, it was a stillbirth. She survived, but the child died. It was full-term pregnancy, but she couldn't deliver it. There was nobody around. The PHC did not have a gynac. There was no help available. And we're talking in 2021. In 1984, the story was the same when I wrote about it. So I think, journalists can find angles that are for their particular state. The thing is, these national stories don't work, and just writing just generally about data will be carried once and then forgotten. But I think from each of those data, whether it's stunting of children, whether it's anemia, I think NFHS also has on violence against women and general health of women. So there are many angles, and each of them can be illustrated by actually going to an area or getting in touch with an NGO that works on these issues of health of women. And then you can always find a community or an area where you can actually illustrate the statistic. I think that is the thing to do, illustrate the statistic through a human story. And if you do that, then you can use the statistics to back the story. But the story should be about that woman or that community or why this has happened, and what her memory is of what it was 5 years ago, what she thinks, why it hasn't changed, and then get, of course, your official version and all the other stuff, but center it on an actual person who has suffered or a group of people who have suffered, and to illustrate the data. That is the way I would do it. And it's just a fund of Bhatesh, you really can do a lot on Haryana. I'm sure there's lots of material in that.
Basically, you are saying that case studies are important whenever we do data stories.
Yeah, I'm saying translate data into human interest, because after all, the data is representing human beings, right? So we have to find the people who, when we say anemia, who are these women? And in all our states, they are there. We have to find them, and we have to find out why. Why have public services not reached them? Public health, they're supposed to get folic acid tablets, for instance, pregnant women. Why are they not reaching? Is it because the ASHA workers are not doing their work? Is it because the PHCs in the areas are not well equipped? There's a whole line of things that doesn't change. Sometimes there's no road. In the areas in Maharashtra that I'm talking about, some of these areas, I believe, still don't have a road, a motorable road. So how can you talk about public health if there's no motorable road for an ambulance to reach a village? So, but I think these stories must be told many times over. We can't just, and the idea, I mean, the importance of having something something like an NFHS come out is it gives you a peg, because just out of the blue, if you do a story, maybe it won't be done. But if you have a peg like NFHS, then you can peg your story on the fact that this data has come out.
Kalpana and Bhartesh, I would like to share one of our experiences in our village. As you all know, we work in the villages of Thane district, and we work on anemia in a big way. And we found that women were being given tablets, but they were not using it. And the reason they were not, we did focus group discussions with pregnant women and the community, family, and then we found that the women were not using the IFA tablets because it causes a lot of constipation, and no counseling is given to them about constipation. They get green stools, they get very scared about it. And second thing is that when they take IFA tablets, they feel very hungry. They feel hungry in the middle of the night, and they're not able to, then they feel very giddy, uncomfortable. So they feel it is because of the tablet, and then they don't take it. So we held counseling sessions with the family and the pregnant women, and told them that the women should eat small.
I think Sharda's gotten.
Sharda's net is gone.
Yeah, I think there's a problem in the net that side.
Okay.
I
think that's her point is good one. I mean, this is the kind of, Bhartesh, if you're still there, that's the kind of information actually you will get if you go into one of these aspects of NFHS and explore it. You might find, something like this, which makes an interesting story, that even if the pills are supplied, they're not taken, and what is the reason they're not taken? Yeah.
Right. So any other questions from the participants, or can I ask my one question?
Yes.
So I just have a question which is very more form and structure kind of thing.
Disconnected. So what is missing in our healthcare system is counseling, and also informing the side effects, informing how to handle some changes that come when we use certain medications or certain things. That is the weak link in our healthcare system, and so we need to focus on that. We need to have more advocacy to inform the pregnant and lactating mothers and women using contraception about what are the side effects and how to handle them, and when to report the side effects to the healthcare workers, and so many things. The whole communication, interpersonal communication is missing in our system. So though we have very good records saying that so many IFA tablets are distributed, we see that in our villages, I think more than 60% of our women are anemic.
Yeah, that would be true of many government programs, and I think the press media has written, for instance, on toilets. The statistic is always about how many toilets have been built.
True,
but how many of them are being used is a statistic that is never there, and you only get to know when you go to an area and you see why women are still not using them. There have been stories. Same thing with the gas cylinders. Again, about the Ujjwala project and how successful it is. And it's only some media stories that actually showed that when You go there, you go back after the cylinder, that cylinder will be sitting in a corner and the woman is cooking again on fuel wood.
True. It's the same with, other things. For instance, toilets are constructed as per the government design and not requirements of the family, because there is a certain culture surrounding sanitation toilets, like, they would like to have at a certain distance, certain kind of structure is what they would like to have. But most of the government toilets are created or built using the designs which are approved by some engineers sitting in Mumbai, and not actually, the design doesn't come from people, which also makes it look like something which they cannot relate to. So these are some of the very important things that we need to focus, I think, when we are writing on these issues from a gender perspective.
Great point about toilets. I'll just add my 2 bit to it. I'd recently been on a trip around, certain villages in Faizabad and Lucknow district. And a lot of the toilets were just being used as storehouses for their grains or, for fodder for their cattle and so on and so forth. So I think that's a great point as to why are the toilets really not being used, even though they are constructed. Coming to the next participant who's raised her hand, it's Indu Harikumar. She wishes to ask a question. So Indu, please go ahead and ask your question.
Please introduce yourself, Indu.
Hi, I'm Indu. I'm an artist and I work around gender and sexuality, mostly on the internet. And this was a very interesting session. Thank you so much, Kalpana. I also received the Ladli Award for my work around gender-based violence. So when even Bhartesh asked a question, I, as a person who gets interviewed, I have certain things to ask, and also I've also wondered how to, how do we make I have an issue with usually talking to male journalists because I feel like a lot of my work gets, I don't feel the sense of comfort, and I feel that there is a certain sort of voyeurism that comes in with male gaze. So especially if I'm talking about, I'm not saying everyone does this, but when I'm talking about something like abortion or gender-based violence, it usually becomes very voyeuristic. But when I'm talking to a woman journalist, it immediately becomes something where there is sharing. And it becomes like something that people are more familiar with. Also, one of the questions that I wanted to ask is, a lot of times, I mean, you also talked about media houses also want to do stories that sell or will have, will have higher reach, and which tends to sensationalize a lot of the work that other people are doing, and how does one counter that, or how does one work around that? Because that also makes creators as very vulnerable, because we are subjected as people who are okay, here's a woman who draws breasts, which makes people view me a certain way. So how does one counter this sensationalized journalism that happens so rampantly? That is my question.
Well, my answer is revolution. I'm joking, but I'm not joking also, because, as I said, it's the media is part of this larger political economy that we have in this country. You can't see it as separate from that. And increasingly, because selling, the market is what dominates, So whether it's natural resources, whether it's women's bodies, whether it's children and pornography, whatever, you take a whole range of things. These are all up for sale. And if they sell, then that is the aspect that will be taken and not others. I mean, even in environmentalism, we always say that it's like what I do, I will not use plastic, that those are the stories that get in. When the larger stories of the rapaciousness of certain industrial houses in this country, and the manner in which they're finishing off our forests in order to get to the coal underneath, the way in which the government and this kind of crony capitalism is destroying the environment, those stories find it much more difficult because the media is owned by those same crony capitalists, So as to what you're saying, unfortunately, that is part of the package now in the media. Even the most staid newspapers now, you find, are packaging themselves so that they have a little bit of this titillation in order to sell, and this was not there in the 80s, frankly. It's changed since the 90s and progressively gotten worse. And television has amped it up to another level altogether. And social media now, similarly, anything goes on social media, so all this goes. So it is a chance, it's an opportunity also for people who are independent and try and do something innovative and different, because your ways of reaching out are much more now. You're not dependent on just, say, print, as you would have been, say, in the 80s, because of the internet. But your vulnerability is also greater now because you have these avenues. That means you are laying yourself open. Yeah. And there are no gatekeepers, not enough gatekeeping to prevent, those who are trying out different ways from being attacked. So it's a difficult time, and yet, as I say, there's this and that, And an example, the farmers' movement. I've written on this. The farmers' agitation, mainstream media really did not do justice to it. Initially there was something, but hardly, only those aspects that were violent, the Republic Day parade, thing about them hoisting the flag, that got a lot of attention. That one violent incident, clashes with the police, but the whole manner in which this, for more than a year, these people survived, there were so many stories within stories that were not told. Yet they themselves use the fact of the internet to create trolley times, and trolley times told us the story. So those of us who wanted to know it could get it. And they also use social media very effectively. So despite Godi media or big media not doing it, these people manage. So that's what I'm saying. Parallel to the bad, there's also the opportunity. And I think those of us who want to use it have to figure out, but it means you are more vulnerable. There's no question about it. Because there's no regulation now in large aspects of the media. Print is still regulated, television is regulated to a certain extent, but the internet and social media, it's very iffy, the kind of regulation that is there.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Indu, and thank you, Kalpana, for that wonderful interaction. Some really great question there. So I'm going to come up with my one question, which is, like I said, it was very common structure kind of thing. So are there any tick boxes or nuances that journalists should actually be aware of, or should sort of incorporate or look while they're reporting from a gender perspective? Would you suggest something like, okay, do this, don't do this, don't do that. Like the one that you mentioned, that, you bring in a human angle, or, you don't state the obvious, something more that you could suggest, something that they should, which is an absolute checklist kind of thing. Thanks.
Well, I don't believe in checklists because I think, situations are different for each journalist, actually. It depends on whether you're working for a media house, what kind of media house, what kind of spaces that media house affords you. If you're an independent journalist, how you're going to pitch. So I think each person has to strategize. And I emphasize the strategize because nothing is automatic. And for that strategy, as I mentioned earlier, because of the fact that the spaces for this kind of writing have shrunk, because of the preoccupations of the media on politics, on glamour, on various other things, it is important that we figure out innovative ways of telling the stories that we want to tell, which are stories that should be told all the time, whether it's the anemia in women, or whether it's domestic violence, or whether it's any of these things. But we have to find innovative angles. And I think some of you have done this those of you who got the Ladli fellowships. And I think much more of that can be done, but it requires of us as journalists. Earlier you could pitch something to your chief reporter or news editor. It was much easier to get it in. It got progressively more difficult as I said, the preoccupations of the media houses we work for changed. But when I was at the Hindu, it was a dream time. I could go to my editor and say, I want to cover the elections in Kashmir from a gender perspective, and he would say, yeah, go ahead. So I would go and spent a week in Kashmir talking only to the women and getting from them how they saw the elections, which in many ways was very different from the way the men saw it. So those kind of, it's much more difficult now. I acknowledge that. But I think already, the stories that we've heard, people have figured out. And I think that's the ground rule, I would say, that don't write about the obvious. Don't think you reported a gender sensitive story by merely writing about women. That's not gender sensitivity. Gender sensitivity means you integrate it into whatever you write about. If you're covering an earthquake, a flood, even a political rally, whatever it is, there's a gender dimension to it. If there's a urban issue of town planning, if there is an environmental issue of a forest that's disappearing, if there's a mine collapse, on all these aspects, there is a gender dimension. That is what you should try and excavate. And the old stories, the stories that have to be told all the time on women's health and women's rights, let's keep coming up with new angles to tell them.
Great.
Kalpana, related to
Sharda, you're muted.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So as you know, when we get entries for the call for our Ladli Media Awards, we often get a large number of human interest stories. And I always tell that even if you're writing generally the human interest story is described as a simple, straightforward story about a woman achiever or a woman who has fought against odds, and it is just a kind of a narration of her life. And I feel that often there is no, analysis of the situation which made it different, just because she's a woman or her positioning within the overall social context. So, so could you please elaborate or throw light on how to write a good human interest stories, or what we should look out when we are looking at human interest stories?
See, Sharda, I think the thing is, human interest story doesn't mean what you're saying, describing one particular person. That's not what I mean by human interest story. It means,
but that's how they send it. Whenever we say human interest story, we get entries like that.
No. And also, within the media, there are different spaces. Sometimes it's just a news report, and sometimes you have the space to do a news feature, or you have a magazine feature where you can obviously write a longer thing. So quite often, sometimes you only can do literally reporting about a person. If it's an unusual story, you write about that person. But what I was talking about more was, you take an issue that you want to write about and base it on a person, So there you have to give the context. You give the background. You locate why you're writing about this particular person in the context of, widespread anemia or widespread hunger or whatever. But instead of just writing about hunger, you root it in the stories of a few people. So then you get a combination of what people are going through and an understanding of why they're going through it. But much depends on the kind of space you have to be able to do that kind of writing. And it's not always easy because, many newspapers really don't give the space to be able to write at any kind of length. So how you write a 700, 800 word story in which you bring in context and all is very difficult. So usually it's only in the features sections that you can weave in all these things. But those are also there. So it's a good idea to try and pitch for those. And now many newspapers are actually doing these longer features on a Saturday where they put in, they give much more space to an issue. So it is entirely possible. So my thing about human interest is always to weave it in. But at the same time, sometimes there's just a really interesting human interest story. It should be done. And it will be used if it's a really good and well-written human interest story.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think we're coming to the end of this session. Any more questions? Otherwise, I'm going to request Swati to come and say a formal vote of thanks.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, any more questions, or I would like to go ahead with the summation and vote of thanks.
I don't see any hands up, so let's just go with the summation.
Oh.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. It was really...
Swati, there's a question now. Just one last one from Sudarshana, and then I think we'll be good to go.
Yes, ma'am. I have a question, but it's a bit out of topic. Actually, as a student, I was thinking I could start writing columns. So if ma'am could just help and guide me, because I'm totally clueless of how to start and where to start.
So Darshana, writing columns is not easy. Most newspapers and even websites take columns, very few columns, and usually only from people who are fairly well established. So you should not start your writing career by thinking about columns. You should try and, I don't know, you just write about the things you know and see if there is some website where you can post it, or create your own blog where you can start writing. If you really like to write, why don't you create a blog and write? I mean, many people have started that way. And then based on that, you can work up, enough confidence to be able to pitch something to a newspaper. But, columns are opinions usually, and often it is people already with some experience who are asked to do columns. So pitching a column is a little more difficult, but pitching a story is easier if you have an idea and you can develop it and try and get it in somewhere. And as I said, in the meantime, why don't you just, if you have many ideas, just start writing. There's no shortcut to writing. There's no shortcut to reading and writing to be a good journalist. You have to read a lot and you have to write as much as you can. That's the only way you carry on being a journalist. When I was young, I remember asking a very senior journalist, "Oh, you write so well, how can I write?" And he said, "Nothing, just read a lot, write a lot. That's it." And I've always remembered that.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Swati?
Thank you, Sudarshana, for that question, and Kalpana ji for your response to that. So, now summing up this entire session, 2-hour session, it's going to be a bit difficult for me. But just to point out that this session was developed for our fellows and fellow journalists who have joined us to interact with Kalpana ji and receive feedback on the fellowship articles that have already been written, and also to get to know better how to integrate gender perspective in media reporting. So the first thing that is very clear is that writing on gender does not mean developing a story around some gender specific statistics. It's not writing about the obvious. And some of the examples that Kalpana ji has given is about her, from her experience of how she learned to look at the stories from the gender perspective when it came to writing about energy, where the focus was on how cooking fuel is a very important aspect of energy, which we usually forget to think about, or displacement story that came from the NTPC Singrauli power plant that also had a gender angle. It's very one thing that actually I really related to is the women in forest, because they are foragers and they are so rooted to the forest as well as the communities. And as soon as we have these conservation issues, it actually affects the communities' economic economic well-being as well as their health. So there is another gender angle to it. The most important one, which as Dr. Sharda shared later, is sanitation. Sanitation is definitely a women's issue, as Kalpana ji also mentioned. So there are so many of these topics. The farmers' agitation actually brought to the fore the idea of a farmer that is not just male, but also female. We usually tend to forget that because women farmers are usually in the background, and we don't really see that as a picture of a farmer. So there are so many topics that we can look at from a gender perspective. So population first, I'm really glad that through the fellowships we are able to, provide a platform for all our fellow journalists to write about such stories. Uh, I think Kalpana ji has highlighted that there were some good stories that she appreciated about how mental health of ASHA workers was one article. The other one was Women's Commission that was wound up during the abrogation of 370, which actually links to the politics of the area, and it was a good attempt at integrating gender perspective in a contemporary and ongoing evolving issue. We also you can also check out Missing Half the Story, that was edited by Kalpana ji, and her own book Silence and Storm, which will help all of you to get a much better idea on how to write on not gender based, but how to integrate gender perspective in your media reporting. There has been a change in how men and women are being covered in media for the last 50 years, and that is mostly because of the increase in representation of women in the media houses. The women's movement in the 80s also contributed to it. Campaigning of women's groups and journalists who took up the issues of sexism in media has also actually led to certain changes. And for instance, today's journalists would not take lightly to the kind of sexism that probably the earlier generation of journalists had to face. And the same thing is true for the younger men journalists as well, that they are a lot more aware of situations that has a color of sexism in their media houses. So they are also there as allies today. So a lot has changed, but there is a lot more to go as well. So and also gender has to be looked from political economy and the perspective of today's global consumerism. Patriarchy and masculinization of politics has not left our society, and that is the problem. And maybe that is the point which indicates that we have further a long way to go in actually truly becoming progressive when it comes to gender justice, gender equality, and gender sensitization. Also, domestic violence stories can be told from a perspective of one individual. The whole aspect of giving a human interest angle is very important to make it so that people will be able to realize that this is not something that we can just gloss over. Usually when it comes to data reporting, that reporting of data, that is what usually happens, that people are not very interested. But once we give a human face, a human angle to these stories, we will be able to actually have more conversations on these very serious issues. Some of the big stories that Kalpana ji feels for the next couple of months and years to come will be where a gender integration in media reporting can play a huge part is climate change, post-COVID health, and how, for example, reproductive sexual health, and especially focus on anemia, for example. There was a question from Dr. Sharda on how we can better leverage the national level data that nowadays national level data that we usually get, that there's not much reporting on it, maybe just a couple of days reporting on just the numbers. So the one way we can do one way we can actually take it was a very nice way Kalpana ji mentioned, was that use NFHS data or any national level data as a peg for stories. If we have if anemia in women is increasing, talk to the regional healthcare providers, visit the villages and areas and talk to the women. Use a human interest story, illustrate the use it as an illustration to support the data, the statistics that we receive from the national, from the center or from a national level. And as Kalpana ji said, that she doesn't believe in checklists because the situation of every journalist differs. Therefore, it is very important and very crucial that each of them strategize accordingly, strategize their story, how they want to present, what they are looking at, what angle they want to present. That has to be done very carefully. The spaces for specific contemporary issues have shrunk because there is politics and glamour and entertainment have taken over all these spaces. Therefore, all of us who are interested in writing have to look at our stories from different angles, and use innovative methods to write about these stories. Just take an issue that one wants to write and base it on a person. The story should be what they are going through and why they are going through. The context of the story is very much important when it comes to gender reporting. And last but not the least, this is something that I also really believe in, is that there's no shortcut to writing and reading to be a journalist. I am not a journalist, but I really do love reading. And definitely there is so much that one can learn when we read and when we are able to articulate it on paper. So with that, thank you, Kalpana ji. I'm a big fan of yours. With that, I will end today's session, your masterclass on integrating gender perspective in media reporting. On behalf of Population First, I would like to thank you for this very insightful masterclass. I'm sure your experience will help all our current and future generation of journalists on how to sensitively report on gender issues in their stories, and also bring in a new perspective, that is a gender perspective, and the most common story, something which we don't usually think much about. I would like to thank UNFP and Royal Norwegian Embassy for their constant support to Population First and Ladvi to make these events successful. Lastly, I would like to thank our team at Population First, starting with Dr. Sharda, our director, for constantly thinking of new platforms, spaces, and topics to introduce experienced voices in the field of gender and media to a broader audience. Malvi Kembhavi, Ritu Motial, Pooja Namdev, and Sangeeta Vaje for putting together this event and working behind the scenes non-stop, and Swapnil, Sangeeta Tribhuwan, and Fazal Pathan for their constant support. I hope you all had a good evening and wish you a good day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Nicely summed up. Swati, congratulations.
Thank you, ma'am.
That was good, Swati.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We now come to an end, and thank you for joining. Thank you, ma'am. I wish everyone a happy evening and a good weekend. Enjoy yourselves, contemplate, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalpana. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.